Hello and welcome. We are here to discuss the future of the Indian schooling system, an issue that has become all the more critical with the disruption of education caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. The future of India lies in providing its children with a sound education. Even though the country has achieved near universal access to education, the quality of education remains a big cause of concern. We are here today for the launch of the report, Liberalization of India's Private Schools, which pushes for urgent and bold reforms in private education in India. The report has been released by FICCI Arise, the FICCI Alliance for Reimagining School Education, and has been authored by Vardan Kabra and Anupam Gupta. We have an action-packed hour. We will begin this session with opening remarks from Manit Jain, the chairman for FICCI Arise, and the co-founder and director of the Heritage Group of Schools. This will be followed by a short intervention from the author of the report, Vardan Kabra, who is the co-founder of the Fountainhead School in Gujarat. And after that, we will have a discussion where we will hear from all our panelists. Our speakers today are at the forefront of shaping education policy in India, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from everyone in this virtual room that we have put together. Let's get this rolling. Mr. Manit Jain, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Sunaina. And thank you, ORF, for putting this important discussion together to formally launch the FICCI Arise report on liberalization of India's private schools. FICCI Alliance for Reimagining Schools is an association of about 1,400 schools across the country, 23 states, and having had numerous dialogues with relevant policymakers and seeing their evolving focus on enhancement of quality in education and their openness, we think the time is right to introduce some concrete structural reforms in the right direction. As we all know, about half of our school-going students study in private schools. What might be surprising for some of you is that about 70% of them are in schools with fee structures lower than 1,000 rupees a month, which means less than half of the average government spend in their own schools. The outcomes in many of our institutions, whether it is government or private, are dismal. And given that we're sitting in the fourth industrial revolution now with humans competing with machines, there is a great and urgent need to do something about it. As per the UNDP estimates, the total financial requirement for India to reach the Sustainable Development Goals 4 by 2030 is an average of $173 billion per year. Currently, our budget stands at about 76 billion, and it is fairly obvious that the government alone won't be able to shore up these investments to the required levels and would need significant private participation. Now, if we need investments, we need to incentivize investors. The report focuses on rationalizing regulations, allowing for a reasonable return on investment, and on understanding how the government could fund students rather than just funding schools. With 260 million school going students, we will need all kinds of schools: pure government, government aided, pure philanthropic, private, and private for profit. I want to thank Vardhan and Anupam, who have authored this report, for their brilliant insights. And I look forward to hearing from our esteemed panelists on how these reforms could come about. Over to you, Vardhan.
Thanks, Manit, for that introduction. I'm very pleased to present this report and with the support of FICCI Arise and ORF here, and with all the esteemed panelists here. In fact, the report quotes probably all of them who are present here. We've been speaking to them, we've been reading what they've been writing, and we're very happy to be able to present this. So I'm just going to talk about the report, some of the key points, highlights that we've spoken about. Manit has already spoken about some of the key facts that 50% students of India are now studying in private schools, and most of them go to low-budget schools. And he's also spoken about the fact that most of the low-income private schools or low-budget private schools and most public schools are not really delivering the 21st century skills or educational, or not meeting the educational needs that need to be met today for students to be to have an employable, successful career in their life. And there are some significant barriers that have resulted in these learning outcomes. A not-for-profit mandate, which has led to the fact that there are no legal returns on capital, is a barrier for investment for investors, and it also prohibits school owners from drawing a salary. This has led to locking out quality school entrepreneurs in a large-scale manner. There is also inconsistent and complex regulation from the center, states, courts, and which are based on inputs. There are fee caps which are difficult to overcome, and that has pushed the sector underground. And there are also many unrecognized schools. Competition has been historically not significant, and that has pushed prices or fees for schools, a few schools, high, and that has also led to a backlash in terms of fee caps. There is a lack of standardized information on school learning outcomes for parents, and there is generally low capacity to pay for a school of choice. Now, there are three reforms that we are recommending, and Manit just spoke about them: rationalizing regulations, liberalizing schools, removing the philanthropic mandate, and directly funding students, which we believe can transform the school sector in the next 10, 15 years, and allowing schools to deliver 21st century education. When we talk about rationalizing regulations, it means first shifting from input-based norms to outcome-based norms, and that's something which the National Education Policy 2020 also talks about. Regulatory independence is another factor which is important. Again, something which the National Education Policy covers, where each state needs to have an independent regulatory authority, which is also neutral towards both public and private schools. Accreditation and needs to move to a disclosure-based norm regulation rather than it being focused on inputs, and that will allow schools to focus on learning outcomes rather than on input-based norms such as qualification of teachers, infrastructural norms, and so on and so forth. However, the National Education Policy also does not remove the most important shackle, which is the philanthropic mandate, and that we believe is extremely important. Manit already spoke about the fact that huge amount of investment is required to move Indian education to an international standard, and we are already seeing a huge amount of inflow into education, specifically edtech, where it is already liberalized, and we're seeing new class of entrepreneurs. The sector is formalized, and these are all things which can also happen to K-12 schooling if the not-for-profit mandate is removed. We will also see new delivery models. We will see low-fee school chains. We will see extensive usage of technology if liberalization happens. We will also see more competition, professionalization, and prestige for teachers. We will see innovation in both delivery and governance of schools. Liberalization will also allow for taxation of schools, and that money can then be plowed back into schools, into public education. Competition will also ensure that fees is controlled, and in the short term, if necessary, a fee caps can be imposed. Fee caps on increment can be imposed. The UP Fee Regulation Act is a model regulation that can be looked for, and then FICCI has played a big role in putting that together. We've also seen that liberalization has transformed other sectors in India. Aviation and telecom and retail are some very large examples. It has kept the prices low, but the quality has become much more superior in the last 25, 30 years. We've already spoken about the edtech and coaching classes, which are for-profit sector, which are seeing huge investments and valuations, and that's something that can also happen and move the private schooling sector to a 200 billion sector by 2025. That itself would be a huge impetus in terms of employment, in terms of returns for investors. Globally, also, we know that 5 out of 6 top economies, at least, allow for-profit schools, and smaller countries like Sweden and Chile, a larger number of students study in private schools. Chile has also been ranked highly in the PISA rankings for the last few PISA tests. The one aspect that liberalization alone may not address is the low capacity of parents to pay, and that we believe can be addressed by directly funding students rather than funding parents. So, rather than funding schools, parents could receive a education voucher or a direct benefit transfer, and that will allow them to make choices of their own school. There are states such as Andhra Pradesh through their Amma Wadi model, which are already experimenting with such DPTs. Parents also require to have the information about each school, about their learning outcomes, the safety norms, the fee structure, and any and other important factors. This will allow parents to make an informed choice. It will open up a lot of choices. Uh, the moment parents have funding in their hands, there will be a strong supply side response for low income, for low budget schools as well, and we can hope to see a strong quality sort of chains and schools which can come in, and there are global models which have been successful in that particular aspect. So, summing up, the benefits of liberalizing private schools in India will be: one, significantly improved learning outcomes that meet 21st century needs. Parents will have a lot more choice based on authentic information about schools, and fees will be kept in will be kept in check by increased competition. There will be challenges and risk, and which is something which I hope the panel will discuss shortly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vardan, and thank you also, Mr. Jain. You raised some really important issues here, and I'd like to bring in the rest of the panel now to hear what they think about this. Let me introduce our wonderful panel for today. Mr. Gurcharan Das is an author and commentator. He is associated with the Center for Civil Society. Mr. Prabhat Jain is the founder chairperson of FICCI, and he is the director of Pathways World School. Professor Geeta Gandhi Kingdon is Chair of Education Economics and International Development at the University College London. And Leena Chandran Wadia is Senior Fellow at Observer Research Foundation. Her research is focused on policy advocacy in education. Thank you very much for taking our time for this discussion. Mr. Das, if we can begin with you, you have been a very vocal advocate of liberalizing private sector education in India, and you have stated that there is hypocrisy and doublespeak in India when it comes to acknowledging the role that private schools play. Can you tell us about that and what you think about this?
Thank you, Sunaina. First of all, let me say this is an excellent report, and I think it needs to be disseminated very widely. And the average person in India really needs to understand why industry was liberalized in 1991 and education is still in fetters, in chains. And just think what would have happened. I mean, we saw this weekend Air India, the government admitting its failure to run Air India, and it was returned back to the private sector. And here again, the issue is that if you just free up the private sector, you'll be able to raise further quality, you'll be able to give people choice, and you'll be able to actually improve the outcomes for all in the country. You know, one of the most heartbreaking sights in our country is every year I know I stand next to a school and I see long lines of parents waiting year after year to get their child into this school. Most of the parents are doomed to failure because there just are not enough places. And why? Why are there not enough places in our private schools? As we've just been saying, half the children are already in private schools, but the demand is far, far greater. and the demand is greater because the government schools keep failing. And if the government would focus on improving the private schools instead of shackling and improving the government schools instead of shackling the the instead of shackling the private schools, then you'd have a much better outcome. Now, the facts are that parents between 2011 and 2015, the latest time zone in which I have the facts, the enrollment in government schools fell by 1.1 crores. So all those parents are clamoring to get their kids, to get 1.6 crore children into private schools. And this is according to the DICE data. Based on this trend, there's a need for 1,30,000 additional private schools in India by 2020. This was 2020. Now we are in 2021 middle. Of course, we've gone through this wretched COVID period, but after that, the facts will not be much different. Uh, One reason to get a child into a decent private school is that private schools are not opening at the same rate as the demand for them is growing. And one of the reasons why they are not opening is because the license Raj still exists in private education. It takes 30 to 40 permissions from the government, and each permission requires a bribe. And a decent person is just not willing to pay that bribe. The most expensive bribes, believe it or not, are for one, essentiality certificate. For the government, for some reason, the government has to say the school is needed, it's essential. Imagine that. We are in 2021 and the government has to say, yeah, a school is a good idea to have a school. So they need to give you a certificate. And second, they have to give it to you for recognition. And in some places, these bribes run into lakhs. So this is one reason that deters idealistic young people to start a school. Another reason that these schools are not coming about is the fees control. The problem began with the Right to Education Act. The government realized that government schools were failing and they commanded private schools to reserve 25% of the seats for the poor. A good idea. I think it was a very good idea, but very badly executed because state governments then did not compensate the private schools adequately for those reserved seats for the 25%. And so the fees for the 75% shot up. This led to a clamor from the parents. And many states then imposed price control. They imposed a control on fees, and this gradually weakened the, the school, the health of the schools. And to survive, the schools had to economize, and this led to a decline in quality of the private schools. Then and some schools even had to shut down. But why? Let's ask, why is it that there's such a clamor to get into the private school? Now we know government schools are not performing, but why? Well, 1 out of 4 school teachers is absent in a government school when she should be teaching. Two, the out of 1 out of 2 who is present is not teaching when they should be teaching. And it's not because of poor salaries. The salary in a government school is of a junior teacher is 48,000, 49,000 rupees now, which is 11 times the per capita income. This is, I'm giving one state, UP's statistics, but the rest are not that different. The teacher is not a low paying, in a government school, is not a low paying person. In fact, many of them are earning far more than what private school teachers used to earn. The fact number three, the teachers themselves are not qualified in government schools. Less than 5% pass the teacher's eligibility test, TET. And so we have the situation where children are not learning, and we see from USSR reports every year that the fact is that a child in class 5 cannot read a paragraph from a text in class 2 and cannot do sums, arithmetic sums, from a class 5 in a class 2 text. And
Thank you so
so,
much, sir. Oh,
okay,
sorry.
my time is up. All right, let me just stop there. I just wanted to give you some of these basic facts, and if there's time, I can continue my argument after that.
We really appreciate this, and actually you've touched upon so many topics in this. I'd like to bring in Professor Kingdon now and get her opinion on this. And also, one of the key recommendations in the report is funding of students rather than schools. I know this is something that you feel passionately about. Can you tell us how direct benefit transfers or cash vouchers could improve education outcomes and processes?
Thank you for that uh, invitation to speak. So, I wanted to address a bit more generally before I come to the issue of the DBT. The case for why we need the liberalization of private schools, a lot of the case that has been that I would have made has been put very nicely already by Vardan and Gurcharan Das. I would just like to add a few things to that. First of all, if we look at what has happened to the returns from public expenditure on education, I did a piece of work for the Prime Minister's office via the World Bank in 2015, and therefore I had privileged access to the NCERT's report that had just come out, which was not in the public domain, which showed that learning achievement levels of children between 2011 and 2015 had fallen in every single area of learning. Over the same period, my analysis for 8 major states of India showed that public expenditure per pupil on education, total public expenditure on education in these eight major states had increased by 89% on an average across these states. So you had these massive increase in public expenditure and a fall in learning achievement levels by the government's own data. Both sources of data were government's own. So we had negative returns from public expenditure on education. Secondly, if you look at, everybody knows from ASSER data, because NAS, the National Achievement Survey, does not provide information on private schools' learning achievement levels. That is something that Parak hopes to rectify under the National Education Policy. But if one looks at the vilified ASSER report, we see that this massive difference in learning achievement levels of private and public school students. Definitely part of that is because private school children come from more privileged homes, but perhaps not all of it. There is still a residual private school advantage in terms of learning achievement levels. The cost at which the learning is achieved, there are 2 or 3 parameters one can cite to look at the cost at which this learning achievement level that is produced is achieved. So you can say, what is the cost per unit of achievement? Okay, and so I have a table that I had put in that, which showed that for, again, those 8 major states of India, that showed that it calculated the cost per unit of achievement in government schools and the cost per unit of achievement in private schools, using the ASSER data on achievement levels and per pupil expenditures in government sector schools and private sector schools. And what I found is that the ratio of the cost per unit of achievement was anything between about 3 to 29 times in the public sector compared to the cost per unit of achievement in the private sector. So the value for money from public expenditure on education is so much lower that there is a real question out here. Why is that? One is that because public school teachers' salaries have been increasing extremely rapidly. So I have got a table in which I have looked at in the state of Uttar Pradesh in one state, and the situation is not massively different across states because all state salary levels are pegged to the Central Pay Commission recommendations, because teacher unions argue for roughly for similarity with that. So citing from one state, 12.7% salary growth per annum over the long-term period of 2008 to 2021. Between 2008 and 2021, you got to look at this statistic and to absorb it to understand its enormity. Salary escalation of public elementary school teachers is 12.7% every, there's a compound interest rate every single year, when in fact inflation rate has been on an average of the order of about 3 to 3.5%. So outstripping inflation quite massively. If you could compare it also, you could compare the costs of providing education in India in the public sector with the costs of providing education, through the public sector in a country like China or many other countries. Jean Drèze and Amartya Sen, in their book, uh, which was published in 2013, An Uncertain Glory, India and its contradictions. In chapter 5, which is on education, they have a table in which they show how teacher salaries as a multiple of per capita income of the country. And in India, the teacher salary was 3 times per capita income, and in China, it was 0.9 per, compared to the per capita income. In other words, it was less than 1, and in India, it was 3. So in other words, what India is achieving is at 3 times the cost. And we know that if we were to look at achievement levels, we know that in PISA, China was one among the top, and we were absolutely at the bottom out of 73 or 74 countries. So you can see that we put a lot more money than China, and we get one of the lowest levels of achievement. So the overall economic efficiency of the provision of public education is very much very problematic. Just 2 or 3 quick statistics about size. There is a lot of money being spent on maintaining emptied, hollowed out, abandoned, deserted government schools. Median public school size in India in 2019-20, as per the government's own DICE data, is 63 students per school. Median public school size is 63 students per school. There are 10,06,000 schools in 2019-20. Government elementary schools, 10,06,000. 48.5% of those, or nearly half of them, have a total enrollment in the school as a whole of less than or equal to 60, and an average enrollment in these roughly 5 lakh schools is 30.8 pupils per school. These are catastrophic numbers. And this is not an exaggeration. This is the government's own data. Less than 31 children per school in, roughly half of all public schools, roughly 5 lakh schools. Fake enrollment. There's a big amount of fake enrollment because this is schools' self-reported data. They're so hollowed out that it's embarrassing. And in order to justify continuing to have the teacher numbers that they do, they're having to over-report enrollment. There are financial incentives to do that as well.
Thank you, Professor Kingdon. Can we return to some of these points, and I'd like to turn to the next panelist. Prabhat, as someone who is running educational institutions in India, what do you think are the challenges that you face or that inhibit people from entering this sector, and what reforms would you like to see?
Thank you, for inviting me. I must say I was intrigued to begin with one of the comments that Mr. Gurcharandas made at the beginning, which was about year after year, he watches that long queue in front of obviously a very leading and a well-performing school, parents aspiring to put their children into that school, right? Now, isn't that ironical? If we say that we live in today's world where there is a demand and supply, right? And if there's so much of a demand, why is it that the most leading and well-performing schools are not expanding? There is clearly a demand which is visible, right? And there are schools who have cracked the code, and that's why there are queues waiting outside. But one has to ask a question that why schools which are performing well are not expanding. On the other hand, the other side to it is It's not that the investments are not coming in into K-12 space, but what we are seeing is more of an opportunistic investment that comes by several such people who see such cues and see that there's clearly purely an economic benefit to be made out there, right? And that's kind of investment which is coming in. So it's a dichotomy in which we are sitting. You know, I think if we just step back, take one step back and see where we are today as a nation and where we are headed as a nation, right? It took us almost more than 3 decades to come out with the new contemporary national education policy. Well, it's good that finally it has come out and it's a very, very reformative document. We continue to struggle in this country about literacy and numeracy, right? And whereas the world has moved on to AI, machine learning, design thinking, and 3D and whatnot, and as Mr. Manit Jain was saying, humans have started competing with machines, right? And most of the jobs are becoming redundant. So what it needs that the humans have to keep bettering the machines. We can do something that machines can't do. We can think, right? But that thinking has to be ignited, which means the way the education is transacted inside a classroom has to change. The national education policy actually, creates a platform or gives a framework for that to happen. It's beautifully written document. I just hope it's not reduced to a decorative archive, because any policy is as good as its implementation at the ground level. Having said that, what we also know that education is one space where to measure an impact or any impact that emerges out of any intervention comes with a lag. There is an urgency to make certain changes, but the impact will come with a lag. How many more generation of learners would we compromise in that process? And if change has to happen, change has to happen in all spheres, whether it's the government schools or the private schools. But who are more adaptive to change or who change fast? I don't think there's any trick to that. Everybody knows the private sector probably changes fast, right? So there, an incentive has to be there for private sector to expand. The issues that the private schools face, as was your question, are immense. I can't even tell you. I am not an educator. I don't go to my schools on a daily basis, probably once a month. But still, almost 80% of my time gets involved in education. Why? One thing that we have been able to do, which unfortunately 99% schools are not able to do, is that the head of the school, who is the school principal or the headmaster, or whatever you call that person, has to spend more than 50 or 60% of his or her energy in fixing administrative issues, whether it's a government babu or a diktat coming from the education department or a fee activism having been politicized by some local budding aspiring politicians. So what it does, it takes away an educator's time from where it should be spent, which is inside the classroom, into fixing these things. In our situation, we have taken that on us so that at least we free our educators to devote their energies inside the classroom. But the challenges are immense. I can't even tell you. Sometimes I question myself that why are we continuing to be in this space? There's so many other things that we can do. Probably there are people who are doing great work in this, who are here with a passion and also a vision. The challenges are immense. I just hope that we take the people, everybody rises up and sees what the things are and really decide where we want today's generation to go and the next generations to go. It can only happen if we fix our schools, and it has to be done with a real sense of urgency, and the private and the government sector has to work together in that. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Prabhat. As you said, there is so much at stake. Leena, if we can bring you in now, you heard from each of our panelists, from Mr. Das, Professor Kingdon, even from Prabhat. Everyone makes a case for giving autonomy to private sector schools, but also for the requirement to strengthen public sector schools in India. How do we strike a balance with that? And do you think that the national education policy lays a roadmap for that?
So, having worked on the national education policy, let me just draw your attention to some things that have not been discussed yet. So, why do budgets well? So, our research showed that there were at least 4 reasons. Accountability is, of course, one of them, but I would put it at the bottom of the ladder. The problem is that preschools, government schools don't have preschools. Government schools start at grade 1. Okay, we have Anganwadis and so on, but Anganwadis sort of release their kids at age 5. So parents either had to take their kids somewhere at age 5, and usually they took them to a private school and they stayed there if they could afford it. What we have done in the education policy is to say that government schools must have preschools associated with them. And the other problem was that in those coming into government school were coming in at age 5 rather than 6, and we were doing age appropriate schooling, not development appropriate schooling, which is another reason which I will get to in a minute. The other reason that private schools were doing well is the fact that they were all offering English medium education, which is extremely aspirational among parents. And government schools, especially in all states, are offering education in the government, in the state language. Okay, that too has a problem, and I'll come back to that. And third, perhaps explaining this drop in learning levels drop in enrollment in government schools between 2011 and 2015 is the exodus, because private schools were saying that they were doing computer-based education, they were inducting technology into schools, and they were showing parents around labs and so on. So parents didn't want to miss out on this computer revolution. Reason number accountability was reason number 4. And more importantly, we investigated why we have why was there a learning crisis? And the source of the learning crisis are many. First of all, the fact that education is not in the mother tongue. State governments are stubborn. You want to teach in Kannada in Karnataka, but Karnataka has borders with Andhra Pradesh and Telangana speaking Telugu, with Maharashtra speaking Marathi, in the Konkan region with Konkani and Urdu, and Kerala and Tamil Nadu. So this concept of teaching in the state language, regional language, meant that children didn't understand their teachers when they came to school. Now, you can correct for that because children learn language very quickly in those ages. But you have to wait for the children to learn language before you start. Yeah. The other thing which I mentioned before is the age based teaching. That if you're age 6, then you're in grade 1, and many times you're age 5. And if you're in age 7, you're in grade 2, and you have to know what has to be learned in grade 2, without taking into account the fact that children's developmental capabilities until the age of 8 are extremely varied. Some kids start talking at before 1 year, start walking before 1 year, but some kids start talking at age 4. Motor skills develop at different times. Music and movement, calisthenic skills, and all of them, they have varied. It's only around age 8 that they sort of come all to a certain level of expectation. So, what the NEP has done is to say that treat the foundational literacy and numeracy as one block, age 3 to 8 as one block, and focus on literacy and numeracy. Another reason why education was not going well in government schools is teacher transfers, because teachers are employed by the state government and they are transferred frequently, which means that very small kids also cannot form relationships with their teachers. The teachers are non-local, and so very often speak even different dialects of the state language and so on. So, and then also the fact that children come in at 5, and in rural areas and among poor children are hungry. So NEP said that you need breakfast, not just lunch, but you need breakfast too. And so we've tried to change that. So, I have been speaking for about 4.5 minutes, so I should wrap up. So I just want to say that, we examined this issue of vouchers. We examined the issue of liberalization of private schools very, very carefully, and on balance, we decided not to change. If I have more time, I will explain why. Because you see, there is data among vouchers. So recently there was an international conference at which eminent educationists were asked to name one idea that they would like to throw out, one entrenched idea that they would like to discard in the entire education system. And two ideas, one of them was vouchers, and another one was two ideas relevant to us. One was vouchers, and the other was age-appropriate education. You have to do development-appropriate education, which we've taken care of in the policy. And vouchers, there is international evidence to show that 80% of the vouchers go to students who would have gone to those private schools anyway. But that's not conclusive. There is more she conducted to the education policy committee. So this is why we have not done. But one thing we must do, if we all care about education, that, you know, we all agree that government schools must coexist with private schools, because, you know, the last child has to be educated. NEP has said that every child must get a free education if they need it until grade 12. This is asking a lot from governments, but we need that to happen in a knowledge economy. Children must have a minimum of grade 12 education. So if that is the case, then we need to, all of us, engage with governments and deal with this issue of why is it that governments are not able to deliver. And this is something that is a separate topic by itself, so I will not get into it now. I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Leena. I know that Mr. Das had to leave for another engagement. And we'll turn to Professor Kingdon now. You heard from Leena, her thoughts on the national education policy. What is it that you would have liked to see in that document that you haven't actually?
Well, I think the big elephant in the room, which to me explains why, Leena Wadia just talked about, her research showing why there is a learning crisis. And I think one thing that I would have added in that list, which is also my main gripe with the national education policy, is that at the base of why it is that the public schools don't work so well as we would all like is the lack of school and teacher accountability. I think this is the big thing that differs between public schools and private schools. And this accountability this is a big piece that is missing in the national education policy. There is no explicit recognition that this is a big issue. For example, there's no mention of teacher absence rates, low effort levels, not only absence rate, but even when teachers are present in school, they're not in class and teaching. The probe report also explains in graphic detail what they're doing, because when it is that half the time when you go to school, but among those who are present in school, they're not in class and teaching, what they're doing instead. So I think there is one thing in the national education policy that kind of speaks to teacher accountability, or not system accountability, if you like, which is a very good provision, and that is the recognition in the policy that at the moment there are deep conflicts of interest in the way in which school education is governed. The fact that the Directorate of Basic Education is both the operator of schools and also the regulator of schools and also the assessor of children's learning levels in the schools. If you're your own assessor and your own regulator, you're going to give yourself good marks and you're not going to regulate yourself very well or very strictly. So I think that this is a fantastic thing in the national education policy, but I think that relying on this alone, separating and creating the State School Standards Authority, which shall do the regulation part, and the Parak, which shall do the assessment part. In principle, these are very good provisions, but I think that Manit's point that the problem is that if these should not remain as just, or maybe it was Prabhat's point, that these should not remain as just hallowed principles that are gathering dust in a book, but should become implemented. For example, the autonomy of the State School Standards Authority is extremely important. What is going to be the constitution? Who shall appoint them? How is it going to be ensured that this is not political appointments and then the body becomes, beholden to political interests yet again, so that the autonomy is compromised? So how do we maintain the independence and autonomy of these two agencies is going to be critically important. But I would have liked to have seen more in the national education policy on, a full frontal sort of, recognition that accountability is a key issue. Teacher absence rates are high. When we say that there's a learning crisis and we think of a variety of reasons, the fact that teachers are not even in school, the fact that, 1 out of every 4 days, the teacher is absent. In some states it's very high. I think that also when we say that children are not learning in their own language, and that is a reason for the crisis, the learning crisis, that may well be a part of it, but then we must explain why it is that in states like Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, where they're learning in Hindi and that is the language of the children and of the teacher, why it is that their learning levels are so extremely poor as well, even when teaching is in the same language. So I think that these are some of the points that I would raise.
Thanks, Professor Kingdon. In fact, one of the recommendations in the policy is a sort of twinning between the private and the public sector. Prabhat, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that that can be implemented?
Well, I wish it was easy. In FICCI we started a project called Hum Sarthi, which had 3 levels 1 and level 2. This was started.
Sorry, cannot hear you very well.
Is it better? Because I have the same, yeah. I'm saying I wish it was as easy as it is written, or I wish it's made to be as easy as it is written. Because that actually is the way. In my last remark, I had said it cannot be any more you and me approach. It has to be us, because both are together in providing clear.
Sorry, your sound is a little bit off.
Let me mute and unmute myself again. Is it any better now? Because I've not changed anything. I think I was here last time. Right?
Can I say something on this, and then Prabhat comes back? Hopefully the voice improves by that time. One very brief point.
Sure.
Yeah. So one thing that the new education policy proposes is the school complex idea. And the reason why it proposes that is because it recognizes that a lot of government schools have emptied out. They have, number of pupils now in many government schools is extremely small. So what they have suggested is the idea of a school complex, that around a secondary school in a 5 to 10 kilometer radius around a secondary school of government, all the schools that fall in that will form a school complex. But it seems to me that, because the idea is that they can share resources which cannot be made available to an individual school. But it seems to me that this is not a very well thought out policy, because all the problems that exist in the current schools will be even more compounded in a school complex idea. When teachers are absentee and don't appear in their own school, how likely is it that teachers who are meant to be sort of traveling to the different schools within the complex, that they will appear? Who will monitor them? And so on and so forth. So I think that there are quite a lot of issues there related.
I know, Prabhat, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, so can you hear me now? Is it better?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. There's some magic to it, I don't know. But in any case, so what I was saying about the twinning program, as I said, that's the only way forward, because it cannot be you and me approach, it has to be us approach. But having said that, I wish it can be done. I wish, it becomes possible. An example we can give you is that in FICCI we had conceptualized a project called Project Hum Sarthi, where we actually did MOU with one of the state governments for twinning a government school with a well-performing private school. And the whole project was at 2 tiers. Tier 1 was, assisting from outside, which means assisting in upgrade of infrastructure facilities, computer laboratories, libraries, and other things. And the second was getting inside the school to enhance the learning level by way of teacher training and resources, so that it really creates an impact in the learning outcome. As long as we were doing tier 1, everything was fine. The only problem there was that once you give something, you have to send somebody to keep checking whether things are maintained or not, because it's sad that even if you provide something, it was not maintained at the government level, at the government school level, most of them. As soon as we embarked on tier 2, I tell you, in spite of the amount of money that the private schools invested by way of getting certain NGOs to actually do things and committing huge sums of money, I always say that in education, there are vested interests sitting with strong cartels at different places. It happens in private sector also, as we see there are certain private schools or private higher education, more so in higher education institutions, which form cartels, right? Likewise, there are cartels in government system also. The moment tier 2 started, the teacher unions, who had no business of what was happening, they started coming and objecting. We worked for 2 months, 3 months, 4 months. There was a conviction at the government level. Still, it didn't work. It fell flat. I just hope, with that as an example, but now, I'm a very optimistic person and all educators normally are. I hope, we are able to achieve that, as the National Education Policy also says. I would also add one more thing, because I think a lot of very interesting facts. Vardan's report is brilliant. Dr. Kingdon, Gurcharan Das ji, they presented some very interesting facts and statistics. End of the day, who is at the center of this entire intervention? The student, right? And the parent. Now, let's see what are the three most important areas that a student and the parent wants or expects from a school. A is quality of education or the quality of learning outcomes, right? B is child safety. And C is a predictability of my financial exposure over the entire schooling journey of my child, which spans over 12 to 15 years. Now, these three are the only things that the parent is concerned about. And all these three have very simple solutions. Accreditation framework so that everybody knows what a good school, where a school particularly lies, not ranking, but accreditation, which is rating, right? B, child safety. Again, I think Ministry of Education is working on a manual for all India basis right now on the directions of the Supreme Court. Very soon it should be out. And predictability comes through a progressive self-regulatory mechanism like what the UP Act is, as Vardan said. So with all these things, we can achieve what we want to achieve. And once you achieve that, why do you want to regulate anybody anymore? When it comes to for-profit or not for-profit, the argument that Vardan has made, and very rightfully so, the K-12 education ecosystem is not just brick and mortar schools. Brick and mortar schools is one component of the K-12 ecosystem. Then you have coaching and tuitions. You have test preps. And now, during and after COVID, you have EdTech and, whole sorts of online learning which is happening, which is great. All those are needed. But just imagine, we are talking of our age from age 6 to age 17, right? We're not creating robots here by just feeding them with content online. These are individuals who are growing and who have to learn social skills, how to work in teams, how to think, and sports and everything. So brick and mortar is needed. We as a nation have to imagine, while all the other sectors in the K-12 ecosystem are absolutely non-regulated, and they are attracting money left, right, and center. We see every week in the newspaper how the money is being invested, right? It's only the formal brick and mortar sector which is being strangulated and strangulated more and more. So what are we trying to achieve as a nation? I think we all have to ask ourselves.
Right. But as you said, we must also finally be optimistic. And one of the things perhaps to be optimistic about is how the pandemic has diversified educators. Leena, it has brought in new actors in the space, from the private sector to tech companies, social welfare organizations, different communities stepping in. Do you think we can keep this engagement going? Do you think that there will be other positive impacts of the pandemic? Is India also keeping up with all that?
Thanks, Sinanya. I think the most important value of the pandemic was the fact that it forced everybody, the people who believed in tech and the people who didn't believe in tech, to adopt tech. So everybody has had a chance to experience it and think of its pros and cons and so on. Given that tech can really help in reinforcing learning, because if you have recordings of lectures and if you have recordings of experiments that demonstrate various things, these can be watched again and again. Tech does have a very, very important role to play, and I don't have any doubts in my mind that it will get integrated in what form. As yet it's unclear. Even we in the NEP, we didn't specify details because we wanted it to be done by a group of experts, which we call the National Education Technology Forum, which will have representation from tech companies, from private sector, from public sector educationists and so on, so that you adopt solutions that are the right ones. Because many principals tell us that every other week we have a tech company telling us that here's a cool technology that will solve all your problems. That's not how they cannot function like that. They cannot make those decisions and so on. So I think technology is a very powerful tool, and everybody has realized its value thanks to the pandemic. So we will have to adopt it and roll it out at scale through making considered decisions on what are the right things. If I may, I'll just take 30 seconds to say one thing that I thought was sort of completely agree with in the document, is that the document is saying that why should we worry about teacher qualifications? Now, that is something that I find very hard to understand, because which of us would go to a doctor who doesn't have an MBBS degree? Teacher qualification. No, wait. I know what the answer will be, but I just want to say that the NEP and also the expectation from teachers is actually high. The fact that teachers are not delivering now, or are seen to be not delivering now, that's another point. That this data on school teachers' absenteeism is contested, and we got during NEP consultations, we got alternate numbers on it. Also, teachers are the biggest group of government employees. So governments use them for elections and for various other things. So if you correct for whether a teacher is in class or not because they are absent, because they're absconding, or because they're doing something that they were asked to do, including bringing resources to school or making midday meals in some cases, then those numbers of teacher absenteeism don't stand. Okay, so I think teacher qualification is something we all need to think about. We want them to be able to identify mental health issues. We want them to adolescents have various problems. We need them to be able to do that. We need them to be trained for all these things. Okay, and so
Right.
the focus on teacher education has to improve a lot. And the last thing is that in recent years, everyone has seen that if the Delhi government can bring change in education, and engaged and involved and with political will, state governments can bring change. And
Thank you,
that's what
Leena.
we should.
I'm afraid we're
do.
just completely running out of time. We've got so many ideas and perspectives, and this is a topic which is so crucial that we need to build further on this. I'd like to thank our panelists for generously sharing their thoughts. And for last concluding comments, I'd like to hand over to Vardan and request him to conclude this discussion.
Thanks, Sunena. This was a wonderful discussion. I think we've all gained so many insights. What I would like to close with are 2-3 thoughts. Professor Kingdon talked about the fact that there is what is the public expenditure on education, and our estimate is, if we take India-wide estimate, it is at least 30,000 rupees per student per annum. There are, of course, states which spend a lot more. And there are states which spend less. But if we just take that average and we ask this simple question, that if parents had the choice of spending 30,000 rupees on their kid per annum, where would they put their kids today? At this point of time, where would they put their kids? And I don't think no one is going to answer that with, or anyone who can afford to pay 30,000 is not going to put them in a public school. And the real issue remains that accountability, which has been pointed out, and the fact that there is weak state capacity. There is very little evidence in our history, recent or otherwise, that shows that the state's public schools can deliver the kind of education that we need today, the 21st century education that we need, not just literacy, numeracy, but going beyond that to critical thinking, to analysis, to employability based skills, which are required in the real world. So I think the discussion can perhaps be just framed in the manner to say that why do we need to worry about schools making profit if they can deliver the right quality of education. And as Prabhat said, there can be safeguards as far as fees is concerned, as far as safety is concerned, as far as basic accreditation is concerned. It can be an and model. It need not be an or model. It need not. So schools can coexist. Public schools should improve. They should do much better. They can be, if they can, that would be wonderful. But that is not a reason to restrict private schools from performing and doing their best. And the ideological imperative that education should only be not for profit is bewildering if you consider the amount of money that is there in the edtech and the coaching industry. So that recognition that 21st century education requires innovative education, and that is something perhaps private schools can deliver, is something that is important for all of us to think about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to our panelists.
Thank you.